That was Keith the Farmer, whose favorite writer at the Free Press is guess who? The man sitting to my left, Coleman Hughes. Coleman has a new piece up at the Free Press now. The headline is How the Democrats Rigged the Vote in Puerto Rico. Coleman, I'm going to pull up this piece here because this is, you talk at the beginning of November 5th, we're all going to the polls, and then say, there is, however, one group of U.S. citizens who already know their vote will be rigged. Who are those people, and what on earth are you talking about?
Yeah, so those people are the 3.2 million American citizens that live on the island of Puerto Rico. Their vote is rigged because 2 years ago, House Democrats passed a bill calling for a status referendum in Puerto Rico. There have been many of these referendums, 7 since the 60s, and it's the biggest political issue on the island. They don't really care about Democrat, Republican so much as they care about should the island of Puerto Rico be a state, independent country, or a commonwealth, which is this kind of territorial status, this in-between status. And
the desire for independence is always very low, right?
Very low. It's never gotten more than 5%, only because American citizenship is really prized throughout the country.
What's the
How
percentage
my grandparents were able to come here, for instance.
that wants the status quo?
It's always been really neck and neck between Commonwealth status quo and statehood. So Commonwealth won in 1967 and 1992 and 1998. And ever since the 2000s, it's basically been on a knife's edge between statehood and Commonwealth. And independence gets single digits, and then there's this other complicated thing called sovereignty plus, which is like not really real, but gets between 15 and 30% sometimes.
Sovereignty plus.
Yeah, it's this.
That sounds
it's
like
this
a
kind
plan.
Of lie.
Yeah,
it does.
like a T-Mobile plan or something.
It's similar to that in that it's
Lord.
basically a scam.
Yeah.
Because it's this option where, without getting into it, it's just basically have your cake and eat it too, be an independent country, but also have ironclad U.S. citizenship. And every time the Department of Justice is like, that is not a thing. It's the definition of being your own country is that you will not be U.S. citizens. But there's a lot of huckster Puerto Rican politicians that try to sell this as a kind of have your cake and eat it too option.
Okay, so how did the Democrats rig it?
So basically after 2020, House Democrats introduced a series of bills calling for the first time in history for a referendum that mysteriously omitted the status quo Commonwealth option. They've never done this before. But obviously, it's no secret that Democrats believe they would benefit from Puerto Rican statehood because they think it would add 2 permanently blue senators, several more.
Sure.
And they may be right about that, but they certainly believe it. And so they passed a bill through the House. It didn't make it through the Senate, called the Puerto Rico Status Act. And it called for a referendum with all 3 options, statehood, sovereignty plus, independence, but no Commonwealth option. And the pro-statehood governor of Puerto Rico, Pedro Pierluisi, took this to the Puerto Rican people and said, these are the options they're giving us. These are the only legal options. I'm calling a referendum for November 5th that has no Commonwealth options.
Where was that supposed to have gotten stopped along the way? Should he not have done that? Because, like, what I'm trying to figure out is, we use the word rigged a lot, right? And it does seem like no law was broken. A process was followed that, from a kind of moral point of view, seems to us to have omitted something extremely important. But did they actually do anything nefarious legally?
So the Department of Justice, I don't think this would count as breaking a law, but the Department of Justice has not approved this referendum because it does not include the Commonwealth option. The DOJ only approves of referendums on the island that include all of the options, which makes sense because what's the point of a referendum if you are taking away the what is tied for the most popular option? Really, the whole point of these referendums is to decide between statehood and Commonwealth, so you can't take either one off the menu. I don't think it actually violates a law, and there was actually a law passed in Puerto Rico in 2020 that allows the governor to bypass their legislature and call referendums on his own. The pro-statehood party in Puerto Rico has a history of influencing and manipulating these referendums, but Democrats have never participated in it, and it's never been done this blatantly where literally what has won half the island in the past is just not on the menu to be voted for. And the way they've justified it, both Democrats, like AOC, who co-sponsored this bill, and the other, Puerto Rican and Hispanic politicians in Congress, and the pro-statehood parties, by saying the current status quo is inherently colonial, therefore Puerto Ricans only need to choose between their so-called non-colonial options. And they don't really need to choose themselves. We've already chosen for them that they don't want Commonwealth, which is, of course, it's contradictory, because if really Puerto Ricans don't want Commonwealth, then you would have nothing to fear from putting it on the ballot, just like you have nothing to fear from putting independence on the ballot, right? Because they know independence isn't going to win.
And there's a lot of people in Puerto Rico who are descendants of colonizers themselves.
Yes,
right?
yes.
From Spain.
Yes.
So, okay. The question I want to ask you about Puerto Rican politics in general is something that Americans tend not to pay too much attention to. But if the idea of statehood was approved by the people of Puerto Rico, the kind of complexion of American politics, you say it would add a couple of blue senators. I mean, I was thinking back of the governor of Puerto Rico, Luis Fortuño, back in 2010-11, who was like celebrated by libertarians because he slashed government in Puerto Rico by 20-odd%, and was at that point, I think his downfall is slightly different. But there's a conservative streak there, right?
Definitely.
There's some Republican types in the old school Republic. Does it mean, if you kind of were to incorporate Puerto Rico into the United States as a state, that it would just be a kind of island of liberals or island of Democrats? I mean, what is the kind of political mix in the context that Americans would understand it?
Yeah, so that's the thing. In Puerto Rico, the two major parties, they're not Democrat and Republican. It's all about the status issue. And in fact, there's a funny paradox where the right-wing party in Puerto Rico is the Statehood Party, whereas the left-wing party, which would align more with Democrats on most issues, is the anti-statehood party, whereas Democrats support statehood. So it's kind of crisscross. The right-wing party there is conservative on like gay marriage, LGBT issues, and so, for instance, the current resident commissioner, who is their non-voting representative in Congress, is a Trump supporter, even though she is of the pro-statehood party. And it seems like a total contradiction.
Someone should tell AOC, it might not. If they vote on the referendum, will it immediately start the process of creating
No, it will not.
No.
Although the bill passed through Congress was asking for a binding referendum. So
But that failed.
It failed.
Okay.
And what's happening is a non-binding referendum, because they can't
it's
do
symbolic.
a binding. Yeah, it's symbolic. But what Democrats want is to point to this if ever they do have control both houses of Congress and eliminate the filibuster. They want to point to this and say, Puerto Ricans have spoken. They want to become a state. We don't have to ask again.
Genius.
Right.
Yeah.
And no one knows enough to know that they actually took the only other plausible option off the freaking ballot. But to your question, I've seen numbers as high as like 40% of Puerto Rican voters are unaffiliated with Democrats or Republicans. So I do think Democrats have a kind of slightly overconfident assumption that Puerto
We've
Ricans
seen
would
that a
vote.
lot
Many
with
such cases.
Hispanic voters, which is a term I don't really like using, but Hispanic voters, I mean, and one of the reasons I asked that question is this idea that they'll always be part of the coalition, and you ignore these people for a very, very long time. And again, it's a very disparate group of people, and I'm kind of interested in people who think that Puerto Rico, if included as a state, would just be a stalwart democratic state.
Well, going off that, can we ask you about the other thing that made Puerto Rico be in the news this weekend?
Yeah.
Are you comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, you had some pretty harsh tweets about this.
It's very relevant, I feel, to the point Michael just made, which is the misperception of how first of all, tell us your reaction to that tweet about Puerto Rico being, the joke about Puerto Rico being, floating garbage. And also, do you think that Hispanic voters are likely to take that as an offense, or do you think they're sort of likely to chuckle, laugh it off? And I mean, do you think it's going to have an impact?
Yeah, so my view is that if a joke is funny, it doesn't matter how offensive it is, it just goes down smooth. But if the comedic timing isn't right, then suddenly you feel all the offense. And it's a very unfair position comics are in, but it's also their profession. I think Tony Hinchcliffe, I've never been a big fan of him. I've seen him live, and I feel his jokes often aren't funny enough to justify how mean they are. And this is obviously what happened. You saw even Trump's crowd recoiled from the joke. They went, "Aw," instead of laughing. And so as to whether Puerto Ricans will care, I mean, I have to think some of them will. I don't know if it's decisive, but generally, people don't like having their homeland insulted, especially if the joke isn't really funny. You know, like, I think if Dave Chappelle or Louis C.K. made a really mean joke about Puerto Rico, every Puerto Rican would like it because it would be a really well-crafted joke and undeniable and funny. But the combination of a poorly crafted joke plus the insult, I don't know. Look, I really don't know if anyone's going to change their mind at this point, but it's certainly not strategic. I think even Trump felt he kind of distanced himself from it. So, yeah, it's certainly not smart.
But as a Puerto Rican, as a half Puerto Rican, you don't find it funny?
I would have found it funny if it were a good joke.
That's
I would,
the correct answer. By the way, I was just looking for the correct answer, and I was just leading you to it.
Oh, I mean, there's a million things you can make fun of Puerto Rico about. It's endless.
I would recommend people look at Colin Quinn's special New York Story, where it has a little section about Puerto Ricans, which is very, very funny. Not mean, it's loving, but it indulges in a lot of stereotypes. Coleman, thank you
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
Check out Coleman's piece over at thefp.com.